The first scripture reading for this morning is from Hebrews, chapter 11, verses 1 to 3 and 8 to 16. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith our ancestors received approval. By faith we understood that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he set out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith he received power of procreation, even though he was too old and Sarah herself was barren, because he considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of heaven and as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. All of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. May God's blessings be added to the reading and hearing of this holy word.
This is the first time I get to say anything this morning. I thought I was going to be left out of the show there for a while and go home. You never had a chance to say hello and all that. Actually, I want you to think back, and I pray that you concentrated very hard on what Nathalie was saying a while ago, because that's the scripture I'm going to be preaching on. This one I'm going to talk about right now is lovely, but I'm not going to say a word more about it than the words that I'm saying right now. That's the one. And if you see in the bulletin, it's got a reference to faith for the sermon. That's what I'm going to be talking about in general. The second scripture reading, the one from the New Testament, is just as good, and I encourage you to go home and read both of them later on because they're both rich. This is from Jesus' words when he's talking about what Luke would call the Sermon on the Plain. Matthew has the Sermon on the Mount we've heard of, and Luke says many of the same words but puts them down in a valley somewhere, and you can reconcile in your own mind how one would say valley and one would say plain, and mountain I mean, but that's what they did. And this is part of Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount preached by Jesus on the plain somewhere. And it's just a collection of sayings by Jesus, but they're all pretty rich. You've probably heard of most of them because they're really pithy kinds of expressions. Here they go. I'm reading from Luke chapter 12, verses 32 through 40. Be not afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give it away as alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven where no thief can come near and no moth can destroy them. For where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be also. And also, be dressed for action. Have your lamps always lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes in and knocks. And blessed are those for whom the master finds alert when he does come. Truly, I tell you, he will fasten his belt. He'll have them all sit down to eat, and he will come and he will serve them. And if he comes during the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, then blessed are those who are there. But know this, if the owner of the house had known at what time a thief was coming, then he would not have let his house be broken into, would he? So you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. May God add blessings on this, the reading of God's holy word. Okay, I understand we need to get this all done within an hour. My sermon is only 45 minutes long. So I'm going to talk really fast and see if I can get through all this. I hope that we get a chance to get acquainted as the months go on. It's always a little bit of a complicated thing being a new minister coming into a church and all of that and all that's part of it. And I do that more often than almost any other minister you will ever meet, because for a living, my job is to go into churches and only stay a couple of years. I've done 16 of these in my ministry. And as I was telling somebody later on, come September, it will be my 40th anniversary of being in church ministry. I'm old, you know. I don't know how that came to pass. I just showed up the next day and next day and next day, and suddenly I got that age. And I didn't start the ministry until I was 55. So I'm older than you think I am. I really am. But what I do, and I'll just say a little bit about this now, and I'll say a little bit more as we go along, and then I'll also meet with you here and there, and we'll get acquainted, and I'll say more as we go along there as well. What interim ministers do is come in during the breach. When someone like Ann has just retired, and then you've got to put together a search committee to find somebody new to come in after that, they get someone like me. And typically it's about 2 years. I was at one that was for 3 years. It was a little long. I was at one for was only a summer, like 10, 13 weeks, something like that. And that was the shortest that I have ever done. That particular one, however, and you need to know this too, because it's important, you may have this, that was a bridge interim. That means when the search committee thinks they're ready to call someone, and they target 2 months from now, and so the interim minister starts searching on his or her own, right? And finally says yes to something, and then the person that the search committee thought was going to come said no, so they got to start over again, but the interim's leaving, so they get a bridge. And it happened. I did one of those one time, and you never know. It happens frequently. So you may have one of those after I've gone too. You never can tell. So at any rate, that's the kind of work that I do, and it does seem to take around 2 years, give or take. You're going to call together a search committee. They're going to survey you. They're going to answer a lot of questions, fill out some papers, some essays, write about what the church is all about, study the demographics of the community, the demographics of the church itself, get all that work all put together, and write up all this stuff and answer questions. There's a survey that all of you take as well about the kind of pastor you want and what you've been like in the past, what you want to be in the future, how that's all going to go. Then they send off to Never Never Land, wherever they send those things. I don't know where it goes. And they'll get back a truckload of names. 60 or 70 people will be wanting to come to this church. They got to boil it all down to about 5. They read every single one of those things, and they're 30 pages long. They read the whole thing, boil it down to about 5. Then they send out invitations to those 5 to come and visit. The schedules don't ever work out. They do an interview with every single one of them that they finally pick. They get the person to finally come there. Are you still with me? And then they all come, and one by one they do the interviews. They boil it down to about 1, and then they bring that person in for a second interview. They have a little party, and then they suggest this one to the congregation. The congregation votes and says, yeah, we like him or her. And then the person has to go back and give 2 months notice and come back. That's 2 years. It's just about 2 years to get that done. So my job, which I'll mention again later on, is to try to make this transition time as smooth and perfect and happy and creative and innovative and interesting as I can do and you can do, to make this time not be a jolting kind of a time. And there will be some jolts, there will be some changes. I mean, my goodness, how long was Ann here? 15 years or so, give or take? It's going to be hard to start thinking about having somebody new after that and start off with something else. And there will be a lot of times where things didn't go very well. But times when people would say, let's try something new. And this is the best time. The very best time to try some new project or new program or some new idea is during this interim time. Things are up in the air anyway. Now let's try that thing that we always wanted to do. Already somebody came up to me the other day and said, can we do that open and affirming program about gays and lesbians and all that? And I said, well, I don't know. I've never done one before, but hey, the church is full of that. Give it a shot. We'll just see how that goes. And some people will say, oh, that's the greatest thing since they invented sliced bread. And the other people will say, I'm never coming again if you do that. So that's the way congregations are. And now's the time to talk about that, because we're in the middle of transition and flux anyway. That's when those kinds of things ought to be lifted up. And I said, I don't know. I've never done one before, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. And my job is to make that kind of thing as smooth and comfortable and easy and friendly and creative and innovative as possible. And by the way, you can help me with that. I'm going to stumble and I'm going to fall and I'm going to make a bunch of blunders. And it's your job to come up to me and say, Stan, you really screwed up on that one. And I've got thick skin. And you can say that to me, and I'll say either, oh, okay, I'll change, or I'll say, well, I think I did it the right way and we'll negotiate and work around it. But that's what goes on in interim ministries as well. Just come up and talk to me about it. Don't go talk to the Methodists about it. They don't care. Talk to me. That's the only way you're going to get that done, and we'll move forward. Which, by the way, you didn't think I was going to get to this, did you? Which, by the way, brings me to the passage that I'm preaching on today. The one from Hebrews. The one that I didn't read, because you stole it from me. That's what I want to say something about, because that whole passage really lends itself to the first sermon idea of me being here on my first Sunday and doing a first sermon. It's all about faith. Did you notice that? The entire chapter is sometimes called the faith chapter out of Hebrews. Chapter 11. Go home and read it. It's really good. I'm actually, I'm embarrassed to say this, I'm only going to emphasize the first verse of that. So I'm leaving out a bunch of good material. And I want you to not do that. I want you to go home and read the entire thing. I'm pulling my Bible out here because I'm going to read something else close to that in a second. This chapter is a place where in the entire chapter is talking about the meaning of faith. And there's a couple of things I can say to you about it in background. One of the most interesting, but is also the most meaningless, but it's interesting, is to say to people, because people don't always know this. Do you know this? That the book of Hebrews was not written by the Apostle Paul? Oh, got a yes over there. Or if you're my age, you didn't know that unless someone taught you later. Because we were all raised with a Bible that called this thing the letter of Paul to the Hebrews. That's the way it's listed in the old King James Version of the Bible. But today they look at that and they say, Paul never laid eyes on that thing. That just doesn't sound like Paul, doesn't look like Paul, doesn't use his language, doesn't use his vocabulary. It's not structured like Paul. It's not even structured like a letter. If you read through it, go back and look at all of Paul's letter. Look at Romans and Galatians and Corinthians and Thessalonians and all those things. Every one of them starts off with a basic, ancient way that the Greeks always did their letters to people. It says, I, Paul of Tarsus, and filled with something, and along with so-and-so over here, and you, the great church in Corinth, and you, the people of Rome, or whatever, blah, 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 and we send you greetings. Every one of the ancient letters started like that. I, Paul, with such and such, you, Corinthians, from such and such, and I send you greetings. Every one of the letters in the New Testament say that except this one. It's not a letter. It's just kind of an essay that was written. As a matter of fact, the author of it, only once, but in passing, in describing what he was trying to say, and by the way, I say he loosely because some people believe that actually one of Paul's female followers actually wrote this. That's kind of delicious, but there's no way of proving that. But the writer calls an exhortation. It's kind of an interesting term. It says, in my exhortation to you about thus and such. So that's the closest thing you get to a title of what this sucker is. It's an exhortation. And when you think of the word exhortation, what do you think of? Somebody who bucks you up, right? Exhorts you to challenge and go forward and be strong and don't fail and don't flag and zeal, etc. That's an exhortation, right? It really is that. It really is. Most of the Bible scholars today think, in fact, that it was written either A, after Rome was persecuting all the Christians in it, or B, after Rome had destroyed Jerusalem and burned everything to the ground and persecuted people and locked everybody up and stole all their property and plundered their goods, etc. It really does sound kind of like that, actually. This is the part I was going to read you from something else. You had read to you from chapter 11. Just before chapter 11, in chapter 10, the very end of it, there's these lines. And by the way, I apologize. I hate reading things to people because it's always so boring. But I'm going to read to you a little bit. So you need to remember this. This is going to be on the test later on. If you pay real close attention because there's going to be an exam at the end of the semester. In verse 32, this writer, whoever the writer is, says, recall all of those earlier days when after you had been enlightened, which means after they became Christians. Recall those earlier days after you had become a Christian when you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to abuse and persecution, sometimes being the partners of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on those who were imprisoned, and you cheerfully accepted the plundering of your possessions, knowing that you yourself possessed something better. You experienced and lived through all that plundering and suffering, knowing that you yourself possess something better and more lasting. Do not, therefore, abandon the confidence that is yours. It brings a great reward, for you need endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you can receive what God has promised you. That leads into the passage that is this morning's passage from Hebrews chapter 11. And actually, as I said a while ago, I apologize for this, but I'm only going to say much about the first verse. The rest of it is just as good. But the first verse is good for us today. When the writer says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. Let me unpack that a little bit for you. Some really scary words in there. One sentence. And by the way, this is the only place in the entire New Testament where the word faith is ever defined. Paul talks all around faith, but he never defines it. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. That word assurance is just too big all by itself to be one word. Do you ever, back in high school Spanish class or French class, they ever give you a chapter out of a book and say, translate that chapter, and you didn't know what you were doing, so you went word by word, and you got this word, and you looked up in the dictionary, and you came back again, and found the dictionary had 15 different words for that word, and you couldn't do it, right? It's tough. Well, the translators of the Bible do that all the time. If you ever line up a whole truckload of translations of the Bible, and I've done that, on this particular verse, you'll have 7 or 8 different translations of that word assurance. And by the way, I love this. I cheat. Actually, I don't have 8, 9 different translations of the Bible. I got a computer program that does it. And by the way, if you want it, it's free. It's pretty good. There's some things you can add on that cost money, but the basic program is for free. And there's one section of it where you can plug in just any verse, and it'll give you 25 different translations of that verse. So you can just kind of run your finger down. So, oh, this one translated that way, and the Authorized Version was this way, and the NIV was this way, and the RSV was this way, and you can go all the way down. It's cool. And you find that there's just a bunch of other words underneath this. Now, what they generally are, however, are something that is huge. The actual word underneath this assurance thing is a word for the underpinnings. Something built underneath something else. That's the beginning concept underneath this. It's the foundation that they used to build houses on. That's what this word actually originally comes from. It's that foundation. Now, they didn't have concrete back in those days, but whenever they would build a new house, they would go out and get some rocks, and they'd build a bed of rocks first. Then they build a house on top of those rocks. So it's the foundation. It's the hard stuff that keeps your house from sliding into the mud. That's what it is. That's what this verse originally meant. And one translation I thought was really great translated it as a boulder. It's a big old strong boulder that you stand on top of. Now, if you keep that in your mind, okay, you got that? Keep that in your mind. Something sturdy, big, strong, rock-like, that can't be broken, that you can stand on forever. And then he says faith is that. Faith is the assurance. It's the boulder. It's the foundation. It's the bedrock for things that you hope for in God. And it's the conviction of those things that you just can't see. By the way, conviction is a good translation, but it's always interesting to me. I looked that one up too. And, in English, conviction can be a legal term or it can be a moral term. I'm convicted of my faith, right? Also can be, I'm convicted and going to jail. It's the same word, right? Well, it's that way in Greek too, and the meaning behind this particular version of conviction is the going to jail version. That's what this actually means. It means that you're convicted and you can't get out of it. You're stuck legally once you're convicted of those things hoped for and things you can't see. You're there, and God will never let you go. That's what it means. Faith is not things that you can see. Faith is things that you can't see, but you're convicted of them. Faith is not something that you can put on a shelf. Faith is not a belief. You know what a belief is? We sometimes get the two confused. I do myself all the time. But a belief is a statement of faith. Something you believe it's true. Like, I believe in God the Father Almighty. Do you do creeds here very often? Sometimes, okay. Like the Nicene Creed, Paul's Creed. No, that's a fighter in Rocky, isn't it? All those, you see those things? those are common creeds, but they all start with, I believe in God the Father Almighty. I believe in the fallenness of human beings. I believe that Jesus came to show us a better way. It's statements. Faith is not that. Faith is not tied down that way. It's a conviction of things that you can't see. The best translation for faith is trust, maybe confidence, that no matter what happens, I trust God that I'm going to make it. Now, I don't mean I trust God to heal my Aunt Susie when she's in the hospital with leukemia and she's dying. You're all going to die eventually. But faith is the trust that God will not let go of you when that loved one is dying. God will not let go of you and let you crash and burn in horrible grief and immobility. Faith is that rock that you stand on that gives you strength to go on and on and on. That's what faith is. It's bigger than just some statement. It's bigger than some plan. It's bigger than some concept. Faith underlies everything we do in a church. Everything we do in a church. And I've got to say, by the way, that in a church, we go through some rocky times. I haven't been here long enough to know about them, but I'll bet you, after I'm here a few weeks, I'll start hearing about all the skeletons you got buried in the basement someplace. You've probably been through a few rocky times. I'm sure you have. And I will create some more rocky times for you. I have no idea. It's kind of bad in some way, preaching here and not having a chance to ever hear Ann preach before. And I have heard Ann 2 or 3 times because I used to visit here back in the day. But I've never heard Peter preach. I have no idea what's up like, but I know that I'm not like them. So there's going to be some kind of a change, isn't there? There's going to be some rocky times. And I'm going to bring up some stuff that are kind of rocky. And we're all going to stumble together. And I will assure you that sooner or later, one of you is going to come up and say, Stan, you just really made a mess out of that one. And I'll see what I can do about it. Let me say, by the way, a little parenthesis, a nice thing about Ann, which is, I'm not sure if you all know this, but she's really a mentor of mine. And in the community, she's really a role model for other young ministers coming up. You know what she's like. She's that great, caring wealth of compassion that she's got. We call her St. Anne sometimes. Is that over the top? Is that too much? I won't do that very often, not in her presence anyway. But she's not here today, is she? But so if you want to say something to me about how bad I did about this and how bad I did about that, I can get over that. But if Ann says something, I'll cry. I just want to be clear on that, okay? So I'm going to tell Ann to go and tell you so you can tell me, and I'll get over that already. But there will be those times. There will be those times. And by faith, they won't break you. Because of faith, you won't drop. There'll be some hard things we'll go through. And if you're not going to go through a hard time during this interim period, you're going to go through a hard time in life itself. Every single person is going to hit a wall. Eventually, it's going to take you down. But you're standing on a rock. You're standing on a foundation that will never, ever let go. Now, you may turn your back on God and go somewhere else on your own. And some people do that, and they just crash and burn. But it's not because the rock's gone. It's because we didn't want to stand on it. Faith is the assurance. It's the stone. It's the foundation. It's the assurance of things that we've hoped for in the presence and the mind and the heart of God. And it's the conviction, things that we're convicted of deep in our hearts, of things we just can't see. You can't prove the existence of God. You can't prove the existence of faith. It's just convicted in our bones. And so for this day, and next day, and the next day, and the next day, for the next year, the next decade, until we're gone, God is there and will never, ever, 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 ever let us go. Is that okay? Amen.